Hey, what's up, composers? It's Joshua Sohn. Today I want to go over some important considerations on making a better mock-up for your virtual instrument track. So for those who don't know what a mock-up is, it's using samples of orchestral instruments to create a soundtrack. And nowadays, with the advent of technology, it's much easier to do this. Also, low budget productions will require you to make mock-ups as the final product, and it's important to be able to make a high quality mock-up that is used for commercials, TV, and movies. But in the meantime, I want to just go over strictly with sample libraries and what you could do to make a better mock-up for that. So let's get started. So the first thing is coming up with the concept and finding some reference tracks. Okay, so when you're looking for some inspiration, it's good to maybe listen to some other tracks that are out there and pinpoint some things that you like, and then keep those handy in your session. That way, I like to think of it as a compass or like a guideline on certain things like the mix, the ambience quality, the mood. Maybe it's a certain instrument that you like that is very expressive sounding and you want to emulate that with your own production. Whatever it is, get some reference tracks that you can use and just have that on mute. And if you ever need to reference, you can have it right there and you can unmute it and or solo it and then listen to the track. The second thing is to think about the tempo track. And the tempo track is going to dictate how expressive your track will be or not. Maybe it's a pop track that's just straight all the way through. You don't have to worry about pushing and pulling the tempo or the feel. But a lot of times if it's orchestral, you do want it to ebb and flow. You want it to push and pull. So use some time to think about the tempo track, and if you need to set it up in a way where it will do that. I like to sing my parts on a microphone, and then when the time comes, I'll actually create a tempo track based off of my singing. Sometimes I'll do that with my piano playing too. So whatever it is, you can kind of set up a tempo track ahead of time so that when you're recording strings, brass, woodwinds, all of that can fall in place naturally. The next point would be the palettes. So when you are actually starting out, think of a concept of the sounds you want to use, and then with the sounds you use, balance it out and get that already panned and leveled ahead of time so that you don't have to worry about that as you're doing your recording. So this leads into the next part of the phase, the recording phase. Number 4 tip is going to be have some variances in the timing. So speaking of the tempo track, when you're actually capturing your performance through MIDI, or maybe you're programming it, you always want to do it slightly off of the grid. You don't want it perfectly on all the time. The only exception to that rule might be percussion and maybe some string spiccato lines that need to be really tight. That's one aspect of the variance of the timing. So whether you are programming or you actually are an accomplished piano player and you can do that on the MIDI controller, whichever, just make sure that it can breathe a little bit. Here's some other tips. Number 5 would be incorporate your MIDI controller lanes, your CC controllers like the CC11 for expression, CC1 for the modulation. Sometimes that's for vibrato, sometimes that's for other things. And there's also a plethora of other controller lanes that are offered for each custom library. So for instance, CSSS, what's it called, the Cinematic Studio Solo Strings, will actually give you a CC2, which is the vibrato part. It also gives you some other options such as, on the mod wheel, you can set it up on the short patches like spiccato. It can actually bring the mod wheel up just a little more. It'll change it over to a staccato or staccatissimo, and then next one, so on and so on. So what that enables you to do is to have a lot of different options. Now the trade-off to having all these options with the MIDI controllers is that it does take a little more time, and the payoff can be worth the time because it'll just sound a lot more realistic. Now, on one note with this is you want to make sure your curves on the MIDI controller messages are smooth and gradual. You don't want anything so drastic that's going to sound weird if you do that. Whatever it is, practice those lines and get those curves to fall in naturally. And then so when the time it comes to actually record something, you'll be able to punch in your parts pretty fast. That leads to number 6, layer your samples. Layer your samples. So you want to make sure that you are considering different libraries as well, so not just using one. The more you use, the more full it sounds, because some libraries will sound a little dry as compared to other ones that have a lot more room sound. Every library combination is a little bit different. I know it does cost money to build your libraries up, but a first maybe go-to would be the East-West Composer Cloud. Is only $30 a month, and you can work out 2 libraries. You have the older symphonic orchestra and the Hollywood Orchestra. You can maybe combine those 2 together for $30 a month. You can't beat that. But down the road, you probably want to also look into other libraries such as Spitfire, 8DO, Stress Off Sampling, Cinesamples is another good one. Orchestral Tools is another one. Cinematic Studio Strings as well, CSS. So anyways, that's something to think about. And point number 7 would be practice your parts. Now, practicing your parts meaning making sure that they sound as good as your abilities when you perform it on the keyboard. Sometimes if you're programming it, yeah, you can program it enough where it will sound good, but there's something about just performing it where you can get it to naturally ebb and flow the right way. When you're using your wheels, maybe if you're doing it at the same time, there's a way to do it so that it sounds pretty good, and then that will minimize the amount of time you have to spend tweaking it later. So my philosophy is to perform it right the first time, just like in a traditional recording route. But when you're capturing MIDI, try to do it right the first time so that you don't have to fidget with it so much later. Now, this goes to the next point. So after you capture all of your music and you have the arrangement all set, then you're in your mixing and mastering phase. From here, you have the volume and panning. So when you are working on your volume, make sure that your tracks sound good, by itself to the entire track, but also solo the family of instruments like the woodwinds, for instance. If maybe your flute is a little bit louder than the rest, maybe dial down the flute a little bit. So make sure that your tracks, your individual tracks, sound good on a micro and a macro level as well. And then another thing here is panning. I talked about that earlier. Panning, make sure that any samples that you are layering together, such as let's say you have 2 horn patches, make sure they're actually within the same stereo field. Sometimes there are libraries that will be on the right side, sometimes they'll be on the left side. If you notice that, you'll have to flip the stereo field so they match each other. Sometimes you have to narrow the stereo field. So maybe percussion, timpani, things like that. Sometimes you want to put it all the way to mono. That's just your own personal preference. So I like doing that because it gives it a clearer mix when you start to space everything out in its own field. So try experimenting with panning a little bit more. It's something that is underrated. Okay, and then number 9 would be your FX processing. And this is kind of where everyone starts to think about, oh, reverb. But it's not all about reverb. There's other things to consider that's very important. And just like how any mixing engineer would approach it, you want to be able to EQ, use filters, use compression, and of course, your reverb and delays. So let's talk about filters first. Filters is good when you want to clear up the low rumble frequencies. in everything. So put a high pass filter on anything that doesn't have any information below 100 hertz, like flute, violin, whatever. Next would be your EQ. EQ is good as concept of the Fletcher-Munson curve. If you want some things to stand out in front of the mix, you can EQ it in a way where around the 2 to 4 kilohertz frequency, it'll sound a lot more aggressive in front. Sometimes if you have a lot of percussion going on, you need to clear up the mix that way so that certain instruments don't fight each other. And that'll be around the 250 hertz where you might want to do some cuts and things like that. You can also use that to put more air in the mix by bringing up around the 16K. Buildups happen in the 2 to 3 kilohertz range for strings a lot. So you want to maybe do some cuts, maybe 2 decibels, 3 decibels, something like that. Going into the compression, I think compression in orchestral mixes are not as crucial, but you will use it from time to time. I use it for my suspended cymbal rolls. I use it for solo instruments when you want something to have it sit better in the mix, like a violin solo or a horn solo. I'll actually put a compressor on there so it just sounds like it's a vocal track almost. And then compressors are good for your mastering chain too. So if you're mastering something and you want it to not be too dynamic, sometimes if it's too dynamic, it's kind of weird. So if you bring down the level of the high peaks, then the overall sound will just be more present and almost stronger in a sense. Last consideration would be the reverb. So when you do start to mix, I would highly recommend using monitors for that part on the reverb, especially because that's where you'll be able to hear the ambience. On headphones, it's extremely hard to get a good sense of that. Also, there's a listen button in Cubase, and other DAWs probably have a similar feature. If you press the listen button, it'll actually solo your FX reverb plugin. Also, decay time on your reverb is important. So when you are thinking about the tempo, make sure your decay time matches that so it's not folding over itself. If it's like a fast tempo, then you don't want to have a long decay. You want to probably have a shorter decay time. Number 10, listen to the mix in various speakers with reference tracks. This last point is a simple one but overlooked, especially if you're in a time crunch. But if you have the time and you have a day to just really do some last minute tweaks, listen to the mix in the car, listen to it on your phone, listen to on a pair of headphones. Things like that will help to give you a better, clear picture of the mix. And if there's anything that sounds weird, you can correct that on this very last stage. That's my spiel for today. I know there's a lot that I just covered and it's brief. I probably will eventually go in more depth in some of these points on another video. I hope this helps you to make a better mock-up. And if you like my videos, do please subscribe, hit the like button, leave some comments on this. If you have any questions about mocking ups, then I'll be happy to help. This is Josh signing off. Till next time, I'll see you later.